Standing in my empty church on what should have been the happiest day of my life, I watched my future mother-in-law smile smugly as she announced to the three confused guests who actually showed up, "Well, I guess Monday weddings just aren't popular anymore." That's when Mrs. Henderson, our sweet elderly church secretary, stepped forward with a manila folder clutched tightly in her weathered hands and said, "Actually, I have something everyone needs to see." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me paint you the picture of how this nightmare began. My name is Sarah, and 6 months ago, I was blissfully planning my dream wedding to the love of my life, Michael. Everything seemed perfect until I realized I had one major obstacle standing in my way. His mother, Patricia. Patricia wasn't just your typical overbearing mother-in-law. She was a master manipulator who had spent 32 years controlling every aspect of Michael's life. And she wasn't about to let some outsider ruin her carefully constructed kingdom. The trouble started the moment Michael proposed. While I was still crying happy tears and calling my parents, Patricia was already plotting. She had always envisioned Michael marrying someone from their social circle, preferably her best friend's daughter, Christina. Christina and Michael had grown up together, went to the same private schools, and according to Patricia, they were meant to be. The fact that Michael had never shown any romantic interest in Christina and that Christina was already engaged to someone else didn't seem to matter to Patricia one bit. From day one of our engagement, Patricia made her feelings crystal clear. She would make passive-aggressive comments during family dinners, like how she hoped I understood the weight of marrying into their family legacy. She'd bring up Christina constantly, mentioning how successful she was becoming as a lawyer, how beautiful she looked at the country club, and how her mother always asked about Michael. The subtext was obvious. I would never measure up. But Patricia's real genius lay in her subtlety. She never outright said she disapproved of me. Instead, she would offer to help with wedding planning, then systematically tried to sabotage every decision I made. When I chose a beautiful outdoor venue, she suddenly developed concerns about her allergies. When I picked a spring date, she worried about rain. When I selected my wedding colors, she mentioned how those same colors had been used at a funeral she attended recently. Every suggestion came wrapped in fake concern and artificial sweetness that made me question whether I was being paranoid. Michael, bless his heart, couldn't see it. Patricia had spent 30 decades perfecting her manipulation tactics on him, and he genuinely believed his mother was just being helpful. When I tried to express my concerns, he'd brush them off with, "That's just how Mom is. She means well." It was infuriating, but I loved him enough to try to make peace with the situation. The real escalation began when we chose our wedding date, Saturday, June 15th. It was perfect timing right after the school year ended, since I was a teacher, and it gave us a beautiful summer evening for our outdoor reception. I had dreamed of the state for months, and when St. Michael's Cathedral confirmed our booking, I felt like everything was finally falling into place. Patricia smiled and nodded when we announced the date on Sunday dinner, even commenting on how lovely June weddings could be. What I didn't know was that Patricia had immediately started working behind the scenes. She began with small acts of sabotage that seemed like innocent mistakes. My dress shop called to confirm an appointment I never made for alterations that would have ruined the fit. The florist contacted me about changing my bouquet to flowers I was allergic to, claiming someone from the family had called with the request. Each time, I corrected the issues and moved on, chalking it up to vendor confusion. But Patricia was just getting started. She launched a calculated campaign to turn Michael's family against me. She started planting seeds of doubt with his aunts and cousins, mentioning how overwhelmed I seemed with wedding planning and how she worried I wasn't ready for marriage. She shared carefully crafted stories about my supposed bridezilla behavior, describing incidents that had never happened, but sounded just plausible enough to be believable. Meanwhile, she ramped up her efforts to reconnect Michael with Christina. Suddenly, Christina was everywhere. She showed up at family gatherings I wasn't invited to. She happened to be at the same restaurants when Patricia and Michael had their weekly mother-son dinners, and Patricia made sure to mention every interaction to me in detail. Christina looked absolutely radiant last night at dinner. She and Michael had such wonderful conversations about their childhood memories, she'd say with a wistful sigh. The pressure was getting to me, but I tried to stay focused on the positive. Michael and I were solid, our love was real, and in just a few months, we'd be husband and wife. I threw myself into wedding planning with renewed determination, double-checking every detail and maintaining constant communication with all our vendors to prevent any more misunderstandings. 3 weeks before the wedding, Patricia's tactics shifted into overdrive. She started calling vendors directly, claiming to be me and requesting changes to our arrangements. The caterer called to confirm that we wanted to switch from our chosen menu to a completely different cuisine. The florist reached out about moving our ceremony time to noon instead of our planned 6 p.m. start. Each time, I had to spend hours on the phone correcting the confusion and reinforcing our original plans. But the most devastating blow came exactly 2 weeks before our wedding day. I was at work teaching my third-grade class about fractions when my phone started buzzing with calls from family members. During my lunch break, I finally checked my messages and felt my world collapse. My sister was nearly crying when she left me a voicemail. "Sarah, I just got a call from St. Michael's saying the wedding has been moved to Monday. What's going on?" I immediately called the church, my hands shaking as I dialed. The receptionist, a young woman I'd never spoken to before, confirmed my worst fears. "Yes, Mrs. Patricia called yesterday and explained that you needed to move the ceremony to Monday due to a family emergency. She said you were too distraught to call yourself, which is why she was handling the arrangements." My heart was pounding as I tried to explain that no such emergency existed and that I had never authorized any date change. The receptionist seemed confused and promised to look into it, but the damage had already been done. The invitations had been sent out months ago with Saturday's date. Most of our loved ones had already made travel arrangements, booked hotel rooms, and requested time off work for a weekend wedding. A Monday ceremony would mean that 90% of our loved ones couldn't attend. That evening, when Michael came home from work, I was sitting at our kitchen table with printed emails and phone records spread out in front of me, trying to piece together exactly how Patricia had managed to execute this sabotage. He found me there, tears streaming down my face, holding our ruined wedding timeline. When I explained what had happened, Michael's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a flash of anger that I'd never seen before. For the first time in our relationship, he seemed to truly grasp the extent of his mother's interference. But even then, his response was to try to fix things diplomatically rather than confront the real problem. The next 2 weeks were a blur of desperate phone calls and emergency planning. We tried everything to get our Saturday date back, but the church had already booked another wedding in our spot. Patricia had been thorough in her sabotage, ensuring that the change would be irreversible. We sent out emergency notifications to all our guests, but the response was exactly what Patricia had hoped for. Most people couldn't attend a Monday wedding, especially with such short notice. My parents were furious. Michael's father seemed genuinely confused and apologetic, and Patricia played her role perfectly. She expressed shock and concern about the miscommunication, offered to help contact guests, and even suggested that perhaps a smaller, more intimate ceremony would be more meaningful anyway. Her performance was masterful, and if I hadn't known better, I might have believed her act myself. As Monday morning dawned gray and drizzly, I stood in the bridal suite of St. Michael's Cathedral, looking at myself in my wedding dress and wondering how this day had become such a disaster. Outside, I could hear the echo of our nearly empty church. Instead of the 150 guests we'd invited, maybe a dozen people had managed to make it on such short notice. That's when Mrs. Henderson knocked on my door, her kind eyes filled with determination, and that manila folder pressed against her chest like a shield. What she was about to reveal would change everything. Mrs. Henderson stepped into the bridal suite, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she closed the door behind her. At 73, she had been St. Michael's church secretary for over 20 years, and I had never seen her look so agitated. Her usually perfectly styled silver hair was slightly disheveled, and her kind blue eyes held a fire I didn't know existed. "Sarah, dear," she began, her voice steady despite her obvious emotions, "I need to show you something before you walk down that aisle. I've been wrestling with my conscience all weekend, and I simply cannot let this injustice continue." She moved toward the small sitting area in the corner of the bridal suite, gesturing for me to join her. My heart was already racing from the stress of the morning, but something in her tone made my pulse quicken even more. Mrs. Henderson had always been nothing but sweet and accommodating during our wedding planning process, so seeing her this upset was genuinely alarming. I've been keeping detailed records of all our church bookings for decades. It's part of my job, but it's also something I take personal pride in. Every conversation, every change, every request gets documented and filed. I learned long ago that memories can be unreliable, but paperwork doesn't lie. She pulled out a thick stack of papers, each one meticulously organized with colored tabs and neat handwriting in the margins. I could see my name on several of the documents, along with dates and times that I recognized from our various planning meetings. "When that woman called last Monday claiming to be you, something felt wrong immediately," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice taking on a sharp edge that I had never heard before. "In 20 years of doing this job, I've learned to recognize people's voices, their speech patterns, their mannerisms. The woman on the phone sounded nothing like you." My mouth dried as she continued. She was demanding and condescending, which was completely different from the polite, soft-spoken young woman I had been working with for months. She kept insisting that you were too emotionally distraught to call yourself, but she couldn't answer basic questions about your ceremony preferences that you and I had discussed in detail. Mrs. Henderson pulled out a yellow legal pad covered in her careful script. "I take notes during every phone call, and I wrote down everything she said word for word. She claimed there was a family emergency that required moving the wedding to Monday, but when I asked for details so I could express appropriate condolences, she became evasive and irritated. She flipped through several pages pointing to specific entries. Look here. She said the emergency involved your grandmother being hospitalized, but just 2 minutes later, she said it was your grandfather. When I gently pointed out the discrepancy, she became hostile and started demanding to know why I was questioning her." I stared at the notes, feeling a mixture of vindication and rage building in my chest. Here was proof that Patricia had orchestrated this entire disaster, but it was almost too late to matter. "But that's not even the most damning evidence," Mrs. Henderson continued, her eyes gleaming with determination. "After I hung up from that suspicious phone call, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I called the number she had given me, claiming to be her contact information, and guess what? It wasn't your number at all." She pulled out another document, this one showing phone records and caller ID information. The call came from Patricia Williams' home phone. I recognized the number because she had called several times during your planning process, always asking questions about your arrangements and wanting to know specific details about timing and vendors. My hands were shaking as I looked at the evidence. Patricia had been so confident in her manipulation that she hadn't even bothered to hide her tracks properly. She assumed that a sweet old church secretary wouldn't think to verify her story or keep detailed records. "There's more," Mrs. Henderson said grimly. "After I realized what was happening, I started reviewing all the notes from your previous meetings and phone calls. Patricia had contacted me at least 6 times over the past 2 months, always with seemingly innocent questions, but clearly fishing for information she could use against you. She showed me a timeline she had created, documenting every interaction. Patricia had called asking about cancellation policies, inquiring about what documentation would be required to make changes to bookings, and even asking specific questions about your work schedule to determine when you would be unavailable to answer verification calls.
She planned this entire thing meticulously, Mrs. Henderson explained, her voice filled with disgust. She waited until she knew you'd be in school and unable to answer your phone immediately. She timed the call for Monday morning, knowing that most vendors and venues would act quickly on what they believed was an emergency request.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
They were tears of pure rage. Patricia had stolen my wedding day, manipulated my fiancé, and nearly destroyed the most important moment of my life, all because she couldn't accept that her son had chosen to love someone she hadn't handpicked. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, my voice stronger than I had felt in weeks, "I need you to come with me to the sanctuary. Everyone needs to hear this, especially Michael." She nodded firmly, gathering all her papers and organizing them back into the folder. "I was hoping you would say that, dear. I may be old, but I will not stand by and watch someone destroy a young couple's happiness with lies and manipulation." We walked down the hallway toward the sanctuary, my wedding dress rustling softly against the marble floors. Through the wooden doors, I could hear the quiet murmur of our few remaining guests and the soft notes of the organ playing prelude music. My father was waiting by the sanctuary entrance, looking handsome but worried in his rented tuxedo. "Sweetheart, are you ready?" he asked gently, offering me his arm. "I know this isn't the wedding we planned, but you still look absolutely beautiful." "Actually, Dad, we need to make a stop first," I replied, surprising him with the strength in my voice. "There's something everyone needs to know before the ceremony begins." I pushed open the sanctuary doors, and the small gathering of guests turned to look at us. Michael stood at the altar, looking nervous but hopeful, his father beside him as best man. Patricia sat in the front pew, wearing a navy blue dress and what I now recognized as a barely concealed smile of satisfaction. She had won, or so she thought. The handful of guests who had managed to attend on such short notice looked at me with expressions of sympathy and confusion. My parents, Michael's father, his brother and sister-in-law, two of my closest friends who had taken personal days from work, and a few elderly relatives who didn't have Monday obligations filled the nearly empty pews. I walked halfway down the aisle, then stopped and turned to face the congregation. Michael looked confused, but Patricia's expression had already started to change. Something in my posture or the determined look on my face must have warned her that her victory was about to be short-lived. "Before we begin this ceremony," I announced, my voice carrying clearly through the acoustics of the small church, "there's something everyone needs to know about why we're gathered here on a Monday morning instead of Saturday evening as originally planned." Patricia half rose from her seat, her face already paling. "Sarah, dear, perhaps this isn't the time for—" "Actually, Patricia, this is exactly the time," I interrupted, feeling more powerful than I had in months. "Mrs. Henderson, would you please share with everyone what you discovered about the phone call that changed our wedding date?" Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her manila folder clutched confidently in her hands, and Patricia's carefully constructed world began to crumble around her. Mrs. Henderson walked to the center of the aisle with the confidence of someone who had spent decades managing church affairs and dealing with difficult personalities. She opened her folder and pulled out the first document, holding it high enough for everyone to see. "Last Monday morning at approximately 10:15 a.m., I received a phone call from someone claiming to be Sarah Mitchell, requesting an emergency change to move this wedding from Saturday to Monday," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had presided over countless church meetings. However, the voice on the phone was not Sarah's voice. Patricia shot up from her pew, her face flushed red. "This is absolutely ridiculous. You're disrupting a sacred ceremony with wild accusations." "Sit down, Patricia," Michael's father, Robert, said quietly but firmly. "Let her finish." Mrs. Henderson continued unperturbed. The caller provided this phone number as her contact information. She held up a piece of paper. When I called back to verify the emergency details, I discovered this number belongs to Patricia Williams, not Sarah Mitchell. The small sanctuary fell completely silent, except for the soft sound of Patricia's sharp breathing. Michael's face had gone from confusion to dawning realization to something that looked dangerously close to fury. Furthermore, Mrs. Henderson continued, I have documented here 6 separate phone calls from Patricia Williams over the past 2 months, each time asking detailed questions about our booking policies, cancellation procedures, and Sarah's specific arrangements. She inquired about what authority would be needed to make changes, what verification we required, and even asked when Sarah would typically be unavailable during school hours. She pulled out another document. During the phone call last Monday, the woman claiming to be Sarah became hostile when I asked clarifying questions about the supposed family emergency. She first claimed it was Sarah's grandmother who had been hospitalized, then changed her story to say it was her grandfather. When I pointed out the discrepancy, she became abusive and demanded to know why I was questioning her authority. Michael stepped down from the altar, his face a mask of controlled rage that I had never seen before. "Mom," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "please tell me Mrs. Henderson is mistaken." Patricia's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. For the first time in the 6 years I had known her, she seemed genuinely speechless. "I have additional evidence," Mrs. Henderson announced, reaching into her folder again. "During our original booking appointments, Sarah and I discussed her specific preferences for ceremony timing, flower arrangements, and reception setup. When the caller last Monday couldn't answer basic questions about these arrangements, I became suspicious and started taking detailed notes." She held up her yellow legal pad. "The woman on the phone couldn't remember whether Sarah had chosen roses or lilies for her bouquet, didn't know what time the reception was scheduled to begin, and was completely unfamiliar with the specific music selections that Sarah and I had spent over an hour discussing just 2 weeks prior." My father, who had been standing beside me in stunned silence, finally found his voice. "Patricia, what have you done?" That seemed to break whatever spell had been holding Patricia frozen. She launched into the performance of her lifetime, tears instantly springing to her eyes as she pressed her hand dramatically to her chest. "I cannot believe I'm being attacked like this on what should be a joyous day," she wailed. "Mrs. Henderson is clearly confused, or perhaps her age is finally catching up with her memory. I would never do anything to hurt my son's happiness."
But Michael wasn't buying it anymore. Something had fundamentally shifted in his expression, and I realized that all those years of manipulation had finally reached their breaking point. "Mom, stop. Just stop talking." He turned to Mrs. Henderson. "Do you have proof that the call came from her phone?" Mrs. Henderson nodded and handed him a printed phone record. "The church keeps detailed logs of all incoming calls for security purposes. The number, date, and time are all documented here." Michael studied the paper, his jaw clenching tighter with each passing second. When he looked up at his mother, I saw something I had never seen before. Complete disappointment and disgust. "You destroyed our wedding," he said simply. "You called pretending to be Sarah, you lied about a family emergency, and you made sure that 90% of our guests couldn't attend because you couldn't accept that I chose someone you didn't approve of." Patricia tried one more desperate play. "Michael, honey, you have to understand, I was only trying to protect you. Sarah isn't right for our family. She doesn't understand our traditions, our expectations." "Our expectations?" Michael's voice rose for the first time. "Whose expectations, Mom? Because my expectation was to marry the woman I love, surrounded by our friends and family on the day we chose together. Your expectation seems to have been sabotaging our happiness because you couldn't control who I fell in love with." Robert stood up slowly, his face grave. "Patricia, is this true? Did you deliberately sabotage their wedding?" The sanctuary waited in absolute silence. Patricia looked around desperately, seeking any ally or escape route, but found none. Finally, her shoulders sagged, and the mask slipped completely. "She's not good enough for him," she said, her voice small but defiant. Christina would have been perfect. Christina understands our family, our social circle, our way of life. This girl is a public school teacher from a middle-class family. She doesn't belong in our world. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. My mother, who had been quietly seething in her pew, stood up slowly. Get out, she said, her voice shaking with controlled fury. Get out of this church right now. Now wait just a minute, Patricia began, but Robert cut her off. No, Patricia, just no. He looked at his son with genuine remorse. Michael, I am so sorry. I had no idea she was capable of something like this. Patricia tried one last desperate appeal. Robert, surely you can see that I was just trying to protect our family's interests. By lying and manipulating and destroying our son's wedding day? By pretending to be his fiancé and fabricating emergencies? By ensuring that Sarah's family and friends couldn't witness their marriage? That's not protection, Patricia. That's cruelty. Michael walked over to me, taking my hands in his. Sarah, I am so incredibly sorry. I should have believed you months ago when you tried to tell me what she was doing. I should have protected you from this. Before I could respond, Patricia made one final play for sympathy. Fine, maybe I made some mistakes, but everything I did was out of love for my son. Surely that counts for something. Michael, you can't let this destroy our relationship. Michael turned back to his mother, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, but final. Mom, you didn't make mistakes. You made calculated choices to hurt the woman I love and ruin the most important day of our lives. You lied, manipulated, and schemed for months, all because you couldn't accept that I'm an adult capable of making my own decisions. He paused, looking directly into her eyes, and you're right about one thing. This has destroyed our relationship, but not in the way you think. You destroyed it the moment you decided that your control was more important than my happiness. Patricia's face crumpled as the reality of her situation finally hit her. She had gambled everything on her ability to manipulate the situation, and she had lost spectacularly. Not only had her plan failed, but she had publicly exposed herself as vindictive and cruel in front of everyone who mattered. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward one more time.
Patricia called them too, using the same fake emergency story to cancel your catering order and forfeit your deposit. The final piece of evidence hit the room like a thunderbolt. Patricia had been so thorough in her sabotage that she had tried to ruin not just the ceremony, but the entire celebration. My friends who had managed to attend gasped audibly, and even Patricia's own family members looked horrified. Robert stood up and walked over to his wife. Patricia, we're leaving. Now. She looked around the sanctuary one more time, perhaps hoping for some last-minute salvation, but found only disgusted faces and disappointed expressions. As Robert escorted her toward the exit, she made one final attempt at maintaining her dignity. You'll regret this, she called back to Michael. When this marriage falls apart, don't come crying to me. Michael didn't even turn around. Goodbye, Mom. The sanctuary doors closed behind them with a resounding thud, and suddenly the atmosphere in the room completely shifted. Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly and returned to her seat, her mission accomplished. My father squeezed my arm reassuringly, and Michael's remaining family members looked at us with genuine love and support. Well, said the pastor, who had witnessed the entire drama with remarkable composure, shall we proceed with joining these two people in marriage? Michael and I looked at each other, then at our small but now genuinely supportive gathering of loved ones. The people who were there had come because they wanted to celebrate our love, not because they felt obligated by social expectations. Yes, I said, surprising myself with how strong and certain my voice sounded. Let's get married. As we took our places at the altar, I realized that Patricia had actually done us a favor, though certainly not in the way she intended. She had revealed her true character so completely that Michael could never doubt my concerns again. And she had ensured that our wedding would be attended only by people who genuinely wanted us to be happy. The aftermath of that Monday morning was swift and decisive. Patricia's behavior had been so public and so undeniably wrong that even her closest friends couldn't defend her actions. Word spread quickly through their social circle about what she had done, and the woman who had prided herself on maintaining appearances suddenly found herself ostracized from the very community she had tried so hard to protect. 6 months later, we received divorce papers in the mail. Robert had finally reached his breaking point with Patricia's manipulation and control, and their 35-year marriage was ending. Michael struggled with guilt about his parents' divorce until his father assured him that Patricia's behavior at our wedding had simply been the final straw in decades of increasingly toxic behavior. As for Patricia herself, she moved across the country to live with her sister, presumably to start fresh somewhere her reputation hadn't preceded her. We heard through family connections that she still maintained she had done nothing wrong, that we had all overreacted, and that someday Michael would realize she had been right about me all along. But we never heard from her directly again, and honestly, that was perfectly fine with both of us. Our marriage thrived without her constant interference and manipulation, and we built the life we wanted together without someone constantly trying to tear it down from within. Looking back now, 3 years later, I can honestly say that our Monday morning wedding was more meaningful and authentic than the elaborate Saturday celebration we had originally planned ever could have been. Sometimes the most important moments in life happen when we least expect them, and sometimes the people who try to hurt us end up giving us exactly what we need, even if that wasn't their intention. The most unexpected twist came 2 years after our wedding, when Michael received a phone call from Christina herself. She had heard about what happened through mutual friends and wanted to apologize for her mother's behavior and Patricia's use of her name in the manipulation campaign. What she told us was shocking, even by Patricia's standards. Christina revealed that Patricia had been approaching her regularly throughout our engagement, telling her that Michael was having second thoughts about marrying me and that he had been asking about her. Patricia had even gone so far as to suggest that Christina should reach out to Michael directly to save him from making a terrible mistake. Christina, who was happily married and had never had romantic feelings for Michael, had been deeply uncomfortable with these conversations, but hadn't realized the extent of Patricia's deception until after our wedding stories spread through their social circles. Even more disturbing, Christina discovered that Patricia had been telling people at the country club that Michael and I were having serious relationship problems and that our engagement was likely to end soon. She had been laying groundwork for months, creating a narrative that would make her sabotage seem like she was simply helping an inevitable breakup happen sooner rather than later. But Patricia's downfall extended far beyond our wedding drama. Her social ostracism became complete when other families began sharing their own stories of her manipulative behavior over the years. Apparently, our wedding was just the most public display of patterns that had been going on for decades. Former friends came forward with stories of Patricia spreading rumors, attempting to sabotage their children's relationships when they didn't meet her approval, and using social pressure to get her way in various situations. The country club where she had reigned supreme for over 20 years quietly revoked her membership after several families threatened to leave if she remained. Her charity organizations asked her to step down from leadership positions, and the social invitations that had once filled her calendar dried up completely. Michael and I built a beautiful life together, free from the constant stress of navigating his mother's manipulation. We bought a house, adopted 2 rescue dogs, and surrounded ourselves with people who genuinely supported our happiness. Mrs. Henderson became like a grandmother to us, and we still send her flowers every year on our wedding anniversary as a thank you for her courage in speaking up when it mattered most. The last I heard, Patricia was still living with her sister and working at a department store, a far cry from the life of leisure and social prominence she had once enjoyed. I genuinely hope she found some peace and perhaps learned from the consequences of her actions, though I have no desire to find out personally. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not having the big wedding we originally planned, and the answer is always no. Our Monday morning ceremony with 12 people was perfect because everyone there chose to be there despite the inconvenience, and everyone there genuinely wanted to celebrate our love. We learned that the size of your wedding doesn't determine the strength of your marriage, and sometimes the biggest challenges reveal who your real allies are.
The whole experience taught me that standing up for yourself isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Patricia spent years counting on people being too polite or too conflict-averse to challenge her behavior directly. Mrs. Henderson's willingness to present the truth, regardless of how uncomfortable it made everyone, changed everything. Most importantly, Michael learned that love sometimes means choosing your partner over your family when your family refuses to accept your choices. That Monday morning, he proved that our relationship was his priority, and that foundation of trust and support has only grown stronger over the years. Looking back now, 3 years later, I can honestly say that our Monday morning wedding was more meaningful and authentic than the elaborate Saturday celebration we had originally planned ever could have been. Sometimes the most important moments in life happen when we least expect them, and sometimes the people who try to hurt us end up giving us exactly what we need, even if that wasn't their intention. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.